Now, before I start off this video, I want to say a couple of things. The first thing is that I absolutely love psychology. I obviously wouldn't be doing GetPsyched if I didn't. I wouldn't be doing my counselling psychology doctorate if I didn't. I also want to say that there'll probably be a couple of people that disagree with a number of the topics that I discussed today. And I also want to say that that's absolutely fine, and it's healthy to have that kind of critical discussion. So if you disagree, or maybe even if you agree with some of the points that I'm talking about today, then make sure to hit the comments in the YouTube link, or if you're seeing this on Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram, make sure to comment on these videos and tell me a little bit about what you think. Now, in today's episode of GetPsyched, I'm going to be taking a look at the problems with psychology today, or what my opinion is of the problems in psychology today. Guys, welcome to another week's episode of GetPsyched, and like I said, this week we're going to be taking a look at my opinions of the problems in psychology today. Now, the first thing I want to say about my first issue with psychology today is that I genuinely believe that there is too much of a focus on empirical literature. Now, as I've said that, a lot of people will already probably disagree with me, but let me be a little bit clearer with what I mean. Don't get me wrong, we absolutely need empirical literature in psychology. We need that literature in order to inform our practitioners, inform our therapists, our psychologists to provide the best work for client bases possible. We need research backing in absolutely everything that we do. And as psychologists, we're also scientists. We need, therefore, to have that research, that foundation of research to inform our practice. However, do we focus too much on our need to develop this solely? When I say that we focus too much on empirical literature in psychology, what I mean is that I think that so many psychologists, and we teach trainee psychologists this as well, that your focus of research or your focus of public outreach and engagement has to come through empirical literature. It has to come through published resources, actually conducting research yourself or publishing material yourself. Now, don't get me wrong, this stuff is so valuable, and I've published articles before. I've been a part of bigger teams that have conducted research that's been published. I've published research myself. So I know that these things are super valuable, but I question sometimes just how much effort we put into putting out empirical research when we could also be focusing our attention as psychologists, psychology trainees, or people just generally interested in psychology into other domains where the public are. And the question I want to pose to you is, are psychologists not focusing enough on where the public are? Are we not focusing on those realms or those areas where the public actually reside? Now, I've actually spoken a lot about this recently. I spoke about it at conferences last year. I've done a couple of videos related to this topic, and I've done a couple of blog posts related to this topic, and it's actually one of the reasons as to why I started GetPsyched in the first place. Psychologists and psychological information needs to be in the mainstream where people are. The public do not read empirical literature. They don't go onto articles, they don't go into journals, they don't go into databases to find the latest research in psychology for an issue that they think they maybe have or a topic that they're maybe interested in. Yes, it's absolutely true to say that psychologists, therapists and practitioners are informed by that empirical research and therefore treat the client with that basis of empirical research, but the public don't actually go out and access that content themselves. I mean, you think about it, if you feel like a pain somewhere, if you've got like a really sore knee, or your chest is tight or something like that, one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to research that thing online. It's the exact same when it comes to mental health, psychological concerns. People are going to research that stuff online before they do anything else. Do we want those people accessing content that isn't valuable? Do we want those people accessing content that just anybody has written out there? And don't get me wrong, the internet's full with that. There's so many people that have opinions on different things. There's so many people that aren't qualified that have opinions in areas that they know nothing about. I'm really passionate about psychologists and people that have intellect in psychology actually putting content out online into the public domain. I understand this whole process totally. I get it. Psychologists are concerned about the platform in which they speak. I understand that entirely. They're worried about empirical support. They're worried about being peer reviewed. They're worried about, just saying anything and being criticized. But the truth is that we cannot just sit back and let online domains and people who don't know what they're talking about just constantly spur out information. Maybe you think I'm one of those people, but I do everything I can to back everything I say up in empirical literature, and I really believe that psychologists and people interested in psychology and actually having expertise in it need to be doing this more. I'm a great believer in the fact that psychologists need to be on YouTube, they need to be doing blogs, they need to be on social media, they need to be doing Instagram videos, they need to be doing online content that actually reaches the masses. For example, Name one famous psychologist that you know right now. I'm aware I could be waiting a while. However, people can name every single Kardashian. You know, they can name every reality TV star. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not bashing people who watch that stuff, I don't care. What I'm saying is that psychologists are not in the mainstream. We don't know who psychologists are. Sometimes psychologists are faceless. Sometimes we don't even fully understand what psychologists really do. The public still believe that. They still have that mentality sometimes. They don't really know what psychology is. And what we do is we keep churning out more and more empirical literature, and that's absolutely right, and we shouldn't stop doing that. But what we should be doing is we should be trying to get some kind of parallel to putting some of that content out into the public domain where the public can actually access it. Okay, my next point for one of my big problems in psychology today is the process of actually getting published and the value that this has for professionals. Now, my last point kind of leads me on to this point. The process of actually getting published is so tedious. And it's so intense, and don't get me wrong, once again, that absolutely has to be the process, it has to be the point. We need robust research, we can't just have anything getting published. We need to be getting peer reviewed, we need to be good doing multiple drafts, to be getting criticised in order to create the most valuable research that we can possible. Because like I said earlier, it's vital, it informs practice. However, I genuinely believe that there is something to be said about the challenges that students and new career researchers have in actually getting published in the first place. Now, this isn't necessarily something I would directly change. I think it's something that we need to be considering in psychology, we need to be aware of. One of the things I would directly change is the value that psychologists are held to by the number of publications that they have. Now, you might not think that this is an issue, but I do. Researchers based at universities are often ranked and scaled based on the number of publications that they have attained that year. Now, this can have consequences for the research actually getting published, where a large piece of research is actually broken up. That kind of large piece of research could be one paper, but it's actually broken up into like 3, 4, 5, or even 6 different papers, just in order to increase the number of publications that psychologist has. Now again, you might not think that this is such a big issue, but I actually think it speaks a little bit to the motives behind the research that's actually being conducted in psychology. I think when those motives are anything other than providing good, solid empirical literature to inform practice, then we have an issue. It's often not the case of just trying to get their best work out there, and don't get me wrong, often there's times that it is, but instead sometimes it's actually to boost their professional standing, and I think that's a real issue. And what's more is that the push to provide and gain more publications and more accreditations and publications can actually result in shoddy research and shoddy work being done. Now, of course, this is in part as to why it's so important to have a critical eye in psychology, and as I've said and harped on many times about on GetPsyched, we need to have that critical eye with everything that we read and conduct in psychology in order to pick out these holes where we can fill. It's not uncommon for researchers to actually manipulate data, to manipulate results in order to gain data that's to their favour and that they know is going to get published. This is a kind of side issue within the realms of publication, but often what happens is bodies that publish results or research in psychology, they don't want to publish articles that don't have a correlation. They don't want to publish articles that necessarily haven't found anything. And that actually is an issue, because those researches and those pieces of publication are just as valuable. We need to know what doesn't work just as much as we want to know what does work. Now that's an issue in and of itself, but it also creates another issue where psychologists are then motivated as professionals to try and manipulate data as much as they can to get results, to get correlations, and to prove their hypothesis right. Now, like I said at the start of the video, people are going to disagree with me, and you maybe think that I'm being irrational or that I'm just looking at the worst case scenario, but this kind of stuff really does happen. It also speaks to the funding process in research. You know, if you get results that are positive to your hypotheses and what you actually want to find, you're much more likely to be getting funding or consistent streams of funding coming through. And again, this changes the motivation behind some of the empirical research that's being done. Now, I don't want people thinking that I hate empirical research. I really don't. I study it, I write it, I've published even at times, but we need to be more scrupulous in psychology. This is one of my issues with psychology today. We can't just publish research and think that's the be all and end all, and because it's published it's great. We need to be casting that critical eye over it, and we actually need to be thinking about, is empirical research the be all and end all? My next issue with psychology today is the unequal appreciation of different branches of psychology. Now, for me, this is a big one. In the UK, we have a disparity between appreciations of different branches of psychology. Let me make this clear from the beginning. No one branch of psychology is higher up than the other. If you're a doctor of applied psychology, then you're a doctor of applied psychology. Clinical, counselling, health, sports and exercise, occupational, whatever it is. We don't get that often in this country. We don't understand that. I'm going to try and take bias out of this as much as I possibly can. I know that's impossible, but as a counselling psychologist in training, I'm going to try and remove as much bias as I can. However, the way in which we look at clinical psychology and its hierarchical nature isn't okay. Every once in a while, I'll voice this on my personal Twitter account or my GetPsyched Twitter account, and it often doesn't go down very well. People still see clinical as superior, and it's not. And that's not because I'm bitter or secretly, think that clinical psychology is higher up than counselling just because I'm a counselling psychologist in training. It is absolutely no different to any other branch of psychology on a hierarchical standing. In the UK, we think that it is sometimes because it's a fully funded doctorate with a £26,000 a year salary attached to it. I'm maybe a little bit better about that. However, again, I have had some Twitter discussions about this and how much I think this is actually very unfair, as I'm not surprised that you probably know. And again, it's not really gone down that well. However, the NHS here in the UK and even the study programs that conduct clinical psychology doctorates have given clinical psychology this hierarchical status. For example, I work with some and I have trained with some counselling psychologists and counselling psychologists in training who aren't allowed to work with borderline personality disorders in the NHS. Those kind of cases are deemed only appropriate for clinical psychologists to work with. Once again, let me make this absolutely clear, that's absolutely nonsense. Counselling psychologists can, and of course, work with borderline personality disorders. There's absolutely no reason why they can't. And often it's deemed that it's not appropriate for counselling psychologists to work with them for some reason. I'm still not really unsure as to why that is. And only clinical psychologists are allowed to work with them. That's not the case everywhere, don't get me wrong, but I have heard cases of where that happens. And I think that speaks to this hierarchical nature that we sometimes give clinical psychologists. Now, one of the ways in which I think that we can change this is actually to change the funding structure in which we train counselling psychologists, we train health psychologists and sports and exercise psychologists compared to clinical psychologists. That's not going to happen overnight, and me and even some of my colleagues that I train with have actually written to our members of parliament to discuss this. It's been a challenge to try and get that message across. I talk about it now and again on Twitter, on social media and at conferences, and it's constantly getting backed up. I'm interested in your points or your views on that. Make sure to comment on the video and we'll have a discussion about that. Okay, my next issue with psychology is the challenges for a direct route into psychology for undergraduates. A very small percentage of undergraduates actually go on to progress in a career in psychology. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that there is not a direct enough route into careers in psychology. If psychology is really going to start seeing some integration of undergraduate students and people really moving through the ranks into careers in psychology, then new initiatives really need to start being thought about for those undergraduate psychology students who are looking to progress in a career in psychology. I even think things like apprenticeships or developing work experiences or set opportunities that are available to undergraduate psychology students in psychology services, working alongside and gaining experiences from qualified psychologists would be a great step forward. Okay, my next issue that I have with the field of psychology, and this isn't necessarily directly attributed to psychology, but it does impact it, and I think psychology has a voice in trying to sort this, is the amount of non-accredited counsellors and psychotherapists that there are right now. There are so many, more than you probably first comprehend. There are so many unaccredited counsellors, unaccredited therapists and psychotherapists out there working. I've contacted many of them, not directly because of this issue, but in attempts to try and gain some experience from therapists and then realise that they're actually not accredited. And I've also worked with some in the past as well. Now, legally, no one can call themselves a psychologist, a chartered psychologist, or a doctorate in psychology if they don't have that degree. However, people can call themselves therapists, counsellors, or psychotherapists, even if they have absolutely no understanding of the qualification or the industry. If you're watching this video and you have no experience in therapy, no experience in counselling whatsoever, you can start a website right now, call yourself a therapist, a counsellor, and start private practice and start charging clients. There is something to be said here about clients will recognise when therapists aren't necessarily accredited, things like the BACP or COSCA or UKCP here in the UK. Those are all governing bodies that try and ensure that clients know that those therapists are qualified. However, legally they can give themselves that title even if they're not. And one of the issues I have with this is that a lot of the times clinical psychologists or counselling psychologists refer to themselves as therapists. They actually call themselves therapists sometimes, not always, but they do use that title, and that's not a protected title. I've started to stop actually saying that I'm working in therapy or I train in therapy. I make sure that I use that psychology title as much as I can in order to ensure that I'm using my protected title and I differentiate myself from industries that don't have protected titles. Now, like I said earlier, don't get me wrong, this is not directly attributed or fault of the industry of psychology in the UK right now, but I do think that we have a role to play in actually starting to get this recognised more. I think the UK organisations like the BACP, COSCA, UKCP and even the BPS have to voice accreditation of counsellors, psychotherapists and therapists. We need to ensure that clients are seeing fully qualified and accredited therapists wherever possible. Okay, my final issue that I have with psychology today is the challenges that undergraduates have in actually gaining clinical experience. When I did a bit of market research for this video via the GetPsyched Twitter and Instagram accounts, I reached out to the fan base, to people that watch GetPsyched, and I wanted to understand a little bit about what their issues were, and this was one of the biggest things that people got back to me about, was the challenges that undergraduates actually have in gaining clinical experience. Students seem more and more frustrated with the lack of opportunity that they have in obtaining practical experience. Like I said earlier, I really think that we need to start thinking about like apprenticeships, like kind of a similar kind of thing to apprenticeships, or a similar kind of thing to placements for undergraduates, in order to start implementing new practical experiences. We're very good in psychology of thinking that it's all about academics in a study sense anyway, but when psychologists actually go out into the field, not all of them just work in academia or in research. So a lot of psychologists are working practically with people. And I really think we need to start integrating this experience, this practical experience anyway, early on in a psychology undergraduate life. A lot of undergraduates, and I experienced this as well, gained real challenges in actually trying to reach out to psychologists and actually trying to reach out to gain experience. And this is multifaceted in so many ways. So many of the issues that I've actually spoken about today, I think are directly correlated to this issue. Due to the lack of number of psychology undergraduates going into a profession in psychology, maybe psychology services and qualified psychologists don't really want to waste their time with students who are very less likely to go into a career in psychology. So if I think we start to change some of the things I've talked about today, we will see developments in undergraduate psychology students obtaining practical clinical experience, and I think that's really, really valuable and important. Okay guys, today has been quite a long video actually. We've been looking at some of my issues with psychology today. I think this is an important conversation to have. On GetPsyched, I look at all kinds of things in psychology, psychological topics, psychological conditions, study tips for psychology students, how to construct your dissertation in psychology. But this is a video that I've been wanting to do for a while now actually, to really start to voice my opinion in what I think psychology is falling short on and needs to work on. Maybe you guys disagree with me, maybe you agree. Either or, make sure to leave your comments and I'll get back to you and we can have a little bit of discussion. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching GetPsyched. If you've been enjoying the videos, then make sure to hit that like button. You can share the videos with your friends as well. And you can also subscribe to the channel to get weekly reminders every time I upload on a Monday, and hopefully catch you next week.